We are there, everybody. So first of all, let me thank you all for your interest in this online debate. We had 160 registrations. So I see the people that actually come online is already on 70. So typically for this type of debate, we have about 100 people live. And it's an online debate, so none of us, none of the speakers, none of you had to stand into queues of airports and taxis and everything else, but we did have some little stress before starting. So I would say it's the online equivalent of the travel stress, is the 50 minutes before starting. You know, typically some small things go wrong, but we're all there, all three of us. So let me just start by introducing the panel. So the topic, as you know, is we want to have a debate and a reflection on the EU energy infrastructure policy. And I'm very happy with having two leading figures in this area in the panel. So we have Catharina Sikow-Magny. She's head of unit at European Commission responsible for infrastructure policy. And then we have Dennis Hesseling from Acer. He's heading the gas department. So his responsibility is more than infrastructure, but he definitely brings an interesting view and very complementary to Catharina on this topic. And I will be moderating the debate. You already see the scope of the debate on the right with some pictures. So we'll talk about the 10E regulation. We'll talk about the Connecting Europe facility. And at the very end, we will also have a little discussion on the winter package and what is next for EU infrastructure. It's a debate, but before I ask our panelists to start debating, we'll always ask what you think. And I will go through different topics, and on each topic we prepared a poll to see what all of you think. And then the debate will be also reacting to what we see about what you think. What else to explain? Well, we have a Q&A section on the bottom. So you can do as you are already doing, saying hello to each other. We're all welcoming you here. But as we progress in the debate, you can use that chat box also to ask questions. And maybe I'll pick up a question during the discussion. If not, it will be at the end of the discussion where we have some time reserved for Q&A. And I will be helping our panelists in picking up the questions. So I will do a bit of filtering and I will introduce the question and I will invite them to react. Okay, let's go. So first is, I mean, at European level, when we talk about energy policy, one of the first things we always do is to talk about targets. Targets is a good way to actually express what we're doing in terms of ambition and also to measure to what extent we reach those ambitions. And a lot of talk and debate has gone into the 2030 targets, so the energy and climate objectives we have for the 2030 horizon. And then this slide you've probably already seen, which was used a few years ago when we went from the 2020 target discussion to the 2030 target discussion. And I must say that I was quite fond of the 2020 targets. Our leaders have been very good in creating good marketing, a message that sticks, because conveniently all the 2020 targets were a 20 target. So we had one for greenhouse gas emissions, we had one for renewable energy, we had one for energy efficiency, and then you see a dotted line, which is a 10% interconnection target. I guess it didn't fit in the whole message of 2020, and that's why there is a dotted line. But also, I think there is a dotted line because that target was not included in legislation, in regulation. It was more a kind of commitment that had been made at European Council gatherings, as far as I know, but it had not been at that point already translated in policy and in regulation. Then for 2030, we've been updating greenhouse gas emission targets. We've been discussing again renewable energy targets and energy efficiency. And these three have now also been included in legislation in the winter package. Actually, I think now for energy efficiency, it's 30%. So it's actually higher than what we had at the beginning of the discussion a few years ago. And we have this 15% target that is still on the table and that I guess might be picked up in future initiatives on infrastructure. And before we ask Dennis and Catharina to talk about that specific target, let me ask you what you think. So do you think it makes sense to have this kind of ambition for interconnection, so for cross-border infrastructure? And before I do that, you should also know that there is even a high-level expert group now that is helping Catharina in thinking about this target, and you have the family picture over there. So, but we'll also help Catharina with this process by expressing what we think. So do we say, no, thank you, we don't need a target, it's enough to have some regulation, some initiative on this topic, but we don't need this target? Do you say, yes, we need it, but only for electricity? Maybe you say, no, I prefer it only for gas to help Dennis with his ambitions. Or do you say, no, we should have some target for electricity and gas for 2030? And now we'll launch the poll and we'll give you some time to pick one of these options. Okay. So you see the results now, and you can still answer. I'll give you just a bit more time. Okay, so Catharina or Dennis, who would like to start? So what we see is that most of the participants in this debate think that we should have some target on electricity and gas. Some say no thank you, and then about 23% say only for electricity, but there is really a majority thinking that we should have a target for gas and electricity. So Catharina, maybe okay. I'll allow you to go first.
Yeah, happy to start. I'm actually quite surprised of the result, because we have been also thinking a lot about whether target should be for electricity and or for gas. I mean, you may know the history of the 10% target. It was actually agreed already in a council in Barcelona in 2002, and it was supposed to be met by 2007. It was not, also because the enlargement of the EU in the meantime, and therefore it was carried over to 2020. The target is based on the installed capacity and the import capacity then of different member states. And of course, with the increasing amount of renewables, we have come to the conclusion with any expert that we need to think how the target could be reviewed in terms of 2030, so that it would be both intelligent and simple. That's the challenge. And that's why the expert group is working. We expect it to deliver some results by summer. But already what we can say from the work is that there are different elements. One element is that we have to make sure that the internal market works, so trade between countries. We have to make sure that renewables are well integrated and every country can benefit from the huge potential in Europe. And then, of course, we must ensure security of supply. So this having said, I can't go more in detail of what the expert group will deliver. Target on gas. We have been thinking it a lot because gas is very different. I mean, a lot of our gas, most of our gas almost comes from outside the EU. So how one could take this into account in an interconnection target. It poses quite some challenges, which one would really need to explore, and where the comparability with electricity does not exist to sufficient extent, I would say. Having targets, I think they give political guidance. So I think they are useful from that perspective. They focus the political discussion on the missing interconnectors and the missing elements, which is always useful. But of course, in the end, one has to make sure that all investments are necessary and make the cost-benefit tests. And that's why we have the 10-year network development plan, etc. I think that's enough for me at this point.
Okay, maybe I'll also pick up a few things I read in the chat box. You can choose to react to them if you like, Dennis. So one is from Luis is saying maybe we should have a target that is not expressed as interconnection, but more as being less dependent on Russia for gas. That's an alternative definition of a target. Then also, yeah, another point, interconnection is a means to an end, not an end in itself, but Catharina actually already said that to herself also. Then also, what else are we seeing for gas? Abel is saying actually the target should be higher than for electricity, so more than 15%. Emanuele is saying one size fits all should not be applied, so it's maybe strange to have the same target on each border. Okay, with that, I give it back to you, Dennis.
There's enough input. Thank you, Leo. What I maybe start with the poll itself and then pick up on some of the comments in the discussion forum. As Catharina said, I was also a bit surprised with the outcome to see a large majority in favor of having a target both for electricity and for gas. And I'll take them two separately. For gas, I must say at the moment we don't see a big need for, let's say, such a generic interconnection target. The gas demand has been going down over the last few years, which means overall there's not really a lot of congestion, either physical congestion or contractual congestion. So in that sense, we don't see a need for a big increase in interconnection capacity. There are still a few places in the Baltics, in Southeast Europe, where you miss some interconnection capacity, that is true, but you will not resolve that with a general, let's say, target for the whole EU. So I would prefer to focus more on the few areas where you still need additional interconnection capacity in gas and not work with a generic target. Now, for electricity, there's an interesting debate because, as Catharina says, of course, it focuses the political attention and the political discussion, and I'm sure that is true. At the same time, if you look at the capacity that is made available cross-border in electricity, that's actually only a very small part of what is technically available. And that means that at the moment, we're not convinced that having a generic target on how much interconnection capacity should be built is very useful. At the moment, we think the focus should be on making available the technical capacity cross-border, so for the interconnectors, which is, let's say, technically could be made available, making it available for trade, for cross-border trade. If you look, just to give you one number, on the high voltage alternating current lines, on average across the EU, only about 28% of what is technically possible is made available for cross-border trade. 28%, less than 1/3. That's a very, very small number. Now, we're not saying that this will resolve all the issues. If you make more capacity available for cross-border, you may find some internal congestions inside some member states. That is all true. But we don't think you should address the problem by now saying let's invest in more physical infrastructure for cross-border interconnectors. That's, I think, for the poll and for the results and for Catharina's first reaction. If I pick up on one of the comments that you mentioned, Leo, on the discussion forum, dependency on Russia, I think Luis van der Laan mentioned this one. We do have, let's say, indicators to measure how dependent certain hubs, certain trading areas in gas are from different sources, not particularly Russia, but just any source. And as a rule of thumb, we say you should have at least 3 different sources gas coming in from 3 different sources to your hub. And so we measure this, and you can see those numbers in the gas target model indicators in our market monitoring report. And you see which part of Europe are well supplied, which have different sources with good level of competition, and where, again, in the eastern part of Europe, you have indeed a dominance, in many cases, from Russia, where you still lack some additional sources to have sufficient competition. That's still something that should be worked on, but the indicator is already there.
Okay.
Let me stop.
Thank you. Yeah. You did not yet mention reverse flows, right? I think that was also part of the debate. I don't know, Catharina, if you want to say something about that. In gas, we've had that discussion. That it's so in electricity. Dennis makes the point. It's not only about more capacity; it's also about using what we have better. Something similar in gas, I guess, was occurring with this reverse flow story, right?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, the discussions we are having on gas and the obligation basically to have reverse flow on all existing pipelines is, of course, important. I mean, preferably to have a reverse flow on an existing pipeline than to build a new one in that respect. But maybe I also wanted to comment on what Dennis just said about targets in gas. I mean, we are also saying that to ensure basically competition and lessen the impact of source dependency, all countries should have, through infrastructure, access to 2 or 3 gas sources, which in a way then brings competition to the market and allows to curtail any dominant supplier in any of the markets. So we do have certain type of targets already in gas which are different than in electricity because of the different nature of gas. So indeed what we have already, and we have quite a good grid in gas and in electricity, we should use it efficiently and then build the necessary infrastructure where it is needed, be it on interconnectors or internal bottlenecks in different places.
I'll just pick up one more comment from the forum before moving to the next part, because Olivier made a good point, I think, is why are we not simply focusing on the CBA approach we have now, cost-benefit analysis? Why do we still need these targets, and how do the two interact, maybe?
I would say that we need both. Of course, I mean, before any investment, one needs to do a cost-benefit analysis to be sure that there are more benefits than there are costs to society. But at the same time, as we are speaking about interconnectors which link 2 countries at the minimum, it is useful to have the importance of certain borders, of certain price differences highlighted also at the political level, whereby the cost-benefit analysis might not reach the political decision makers in the same way. So I think very often we have seen that with political targets, we get the political attention to the projects, and then the necessary projects have a smooth implementation ahead of them. So I think that's the complementarity between a political target and a cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah, and if I remember, the documents referring to the target always say if the CBA is positive. So countries that could show with CBA that it doesn't make sense for them to reach the target would have the opportunity to do so. That's my understanding up to now. Dennis, would you still like to make a final comment on this topic, or?
Yeah, maybe also from the discussion forum, I see that Martin Kittel is making a remark about the flow-based market coupling algorithm to expand it to other areas and in that way increase the capacity made available for cross-border trade. Again, we've checked this in the market monitoring report. What we see so far is that it only leads to a small increase in available cross-border capacity. So overall, we think it's a good idea, it's useful, it should be done, but the effects so far at least are relatively small.
Okay, yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so let's go back to the slides and let's introduce the second part of this debate. So first part was about targets. Second part is about the 10E regulation and the Connecting Europe facility. And there is many ways we could have started the debate, but I got a bit nostalgic and I went back to the impact assessment of 2011. And it's always nice to go back and to read that original document. And actually the problems that were identified at that stage, even, why did we take these policy initiatives and what options were considered at that stage, and to see now what we think about those options, because meanwhile we've had some experience, we've made some choices, and we're also going to maybe change those choices. So I think it's a nice way to kickstart the debate. And one of the elements that was discussed in that impact assessment was the issue of permit granting. And actually, let me quote a few things that was said there. There was a public consultation, like always, and there were some problems highlighted at member state level. So it was said that there was a lack of upfront planning coordination. TSOs felt that it was sort of up to them to figure out how the different planning authorities would sort of need to be coordinated. They did not necessarily have time limits. So as a promoter, you did not know when they will take a decision or whether they could just go on and think about it. Also, it was not even clear what some of the documentation standards were. So meaning that if you would apply, you could get into a circle of the quality of the application is not good, so please send me a new application. So many issues. And then some of the options that were considered to move forward to harmonize a bit permit granting at European level was one, a very ambitious one, which is to establish a regime of common interest, sort of a European regime. A second option was called a light one-stop shop, meaning that there is not really a decision-making authority, but there is some coordination. So there is an authority in charge of the coordination, but that authority doesn't really decide. And then the other real one-stop shop, you could say, is to have a decision-making authority for permit granting at national level. So these were the three options. So let me again ask all of you which option you think we should go for. And then we will ask our panelists what they actually did and what the experience with these options is up to now. Okay. I see you going very convinced for option 3, many of you, but there is still people thinking because there is quite some people that still have to reply. So we'll give you a bit more time. You can already see the results, but you can still add your results. Yeah, things are changing a bit. We have some more European thinkers coming online. So, okay, maybe this is good to start a discussion. So, oh no, results are changing a lot now. Last minute. So now we are a bit balanced, I would say. 45, 48 for option 1 and option 3, with very limited people getting excited about option 2. So Catharina, maybe you can remind us what is the option that is actually in the 10E regulation, and if you could change that, which option would you prefer?
Yeah. I mean, the 10E regulation allows member states to choose between a couple of formats. So second and third one, basically. And I think the majority of member states have chosen the second one, whereby there is this competent authority coordinating all the different permit granting authorities within the member state. 1 or 2 member states have chosen this full one-stop shop, whereby one competent authority really is in the lead of issuing the necessary permits. Maybe that at this point I would like to tell an anecdote from the negotiations when we discussed this our proposals in the Council in particular, because we did not have this light version in our proposal, this coordinating version without decision-making power, but it was brought by the member states into the text. And the argument that we heard, I'm now using Sweden as an example, but it was not the only country, whereby they told us that if you have different authorities, in a country which depend on different ministries, like environmental permits, then you may have some safety permits, you may have some fire permits, operation permits. They depend on different ministries. And if then there were to be one decision-making authority overseeing all these, it would have to be the Swedish king. And then we decided it would be too much to ask, so that's why then on Commission side we gave in, because we thought that the king had enough work already. But having said that, and having seen already a little bit in practice how the permit granting works, I mean, it's still very fresh. We only have a couple of years since the entry into force in 2013 of these provisions, so we don't have yet much experience on how this works, how these provisions work. But personally, I think would be good to have a bit of more strengthening there. whether it would be through making sure that the 3.5-year time limit is implemented, or making sure then that the coordinating one-stop shop gives really firm timelines for all the other authorities that are part of the process, or whether we should really think of establishing a regime at the EU level. I mean, these are things that will come back to us now that we are evaluating the regulation, and we will certainly read the impact assessment again to see the different elements from there. But for the time being, we have not yet seen the positive effects of the provisions, which are very strong. I mean, they bring down the average length of permitting from around 12 years to 3.5 years. So it's dramatic, but it has to be made work. And that's what we are still looking into.
Okay, thank you, Catharina. So, Denis, are you ready to establish a regime of common interest in Ljubljana?
Well, I'm not sure if we could do it, but I would support the trend of what Catharina is saying. We monitor the progress of the PCIs, the projects of common interest, both in electricity and in gas. And so we check what their planning was and how they are doing in practice. And what we see is that many projects, more than 2/3, depending a bit on the sector, 2/3 for electricity, even more for gas, are delayed. And if you then ask the project promoters, why is your project delayed? They give you different reasons, but the main one is always permitting. So I think what Catharina says is very true. At the moment, let's say at our last report 1 year ago, we didn't really see the positive effects of this specific provision. Now, they didn't say what would the final solution be. Maybe it's a bit different from member state to member state, but it looks to us like the current regime is probably too light and doesn't deliver the benefits that were envisaged with the 10E regulation. So in that sense, I would be inclined indeed, as also the poll here indicates, to move from, let's say, a majority of member states saying, well, we'll have a light one-stop shop, to something which is stricter and which will probably deliver better results, either the full one-stop shop or maybe even indeed a European regime, if there's enough political support to do so.
Yeah. I fully agree with both of you. I mean, we should also remind everybody that this is only the first real infrastructure package that we had in 2013, and if you compare that with the first liberalization package, that also opened many boxes but didn't really deliver all the benefits, but showed us that we needed to move further to really materialize the benefits of doing this at the European level. So yeah, it's actually already impressive that something was in that regulation on permit granting. Okay, so that was a warm-up. What comes next is a poll with 3 levels. So I will take a bit of time to introduce it. And why do we take them together is because, well, basically they're all dimensions of how to do an investment, right? So from a promoter point of view, one part of it is the planning, but also then is about how am I going to be remunerated for this investment, how are the costs going to be allocated between the countries that are impacted, and what about the financing. And of course they are somewhat interconnected, interdependent, so we will take them together. And again, on each of these topics, I took from the impact assessment the options that were considered at that time. So for investment incentives, the impact assessment of the 10E regulation was talking about what we can do is to recognize that maybe some of these projects of common interest have risks, specific risks that could be incentivized, that could be remunerated somehow. Then there was also this idea that you can not only give incentives, you can also, punish for non-delivery. And so there was this idea that maybe there should be some possibilities of penalties and enforcement actions towards projects of common interest. That's for incentives. Then, and so I will ask you again in a while what you think about those 2 options, which one you think we need to do more. Then on cost allocation, there was already a talk about maybe we should not have the cost recuperated through national tariffs, but there should be maybe some EU transmission tariff for EU projects, which are projects of common interest. So that if we pay at the national level, there is a little component there, which is an EU transmission tariff component. Then there was also discussion on how to share the costs between countries. Either it's paid by EU or it's still paid by national level, but the two countries ex ante discuss how to share the costs, or a variation of that. They share the costs ex ante, they make a deal, but they foresee that things might happen that will trigger a rediscussion on sharing of the costs. That was the third option considered. Then on financing, the impact assessment said, in the past we had this Trans-European Networks program, and what it has done mostly is giving grants to projects. There is also structural funds, there is all kind of other funds, but in terms of instruments, these European funds were mainly giving grants. And then the idea of the Connecting Europe facility was to consider other options, maybe some risk-sharing instruments, risk capital instruments, and then you see the grants that we have always had, or as a fourth option, a combination of grants, risk-sharing, and risk capital instruments. So now we will launch the poll, and for each of these topics, you can pick what you think is an option that we should work on more at European level. And I will give you some time. So now, Dennis, Catharina, you can react to all three, or you pick one, and then we rotate a bit.
Should I start on the first
propose
one,
this time, Dennis?
incentives?
Yeah, please go. So on the first one, please.
So for the incentives, the idea indeed was to say, well, PCIs maybe represent a special category. They may be more risky than usual investments in electricity or gas networks, and therefore we may need a special incentive regime. What we see so far, if we look at what's happened in practice with the incentives, is that there's very limited interest from the project promoters to apply for such incentives. Now, we don't know exactly why that is the case, but our guess is that either the PCIs themselves are not necessarily much more risky than usual investments in energy networks, or there are already national regimes in place which sufficiently incentivize these kind of investments. So frankly, from our side, we don't really see a need for such a provision in the 10-year regulation. It's not used very much. It doesn't seem to be needed very much. However, the second one under this first poll, the penalties, is probably much worse. Because frankly, the PCI list as we know it now is not something that should be implemented. It's a very long list with many, many projects on there. The selection is, let's say, not as strict as we think it could or should be. If you were to really implement all those PCIs, you would massively overinvest in the European energy networks, which is a waste of, in the end, users and taxpayers' money. So we think before you get into any kind of penalties or enforcement, you need a much stricter selection process, and saying, let's not start with a wish list as we now see with the two ENSOs, ENSO-E and ENSO-G, but let's start with really what is needed in terms of additional infrastructure at European level. And then once we have really strictly identified those needs, let's look at the projects which can fulfill those needs. And for those, maybe you can say, okay, now you're through the process, maybe we should either incentivize or have some enforcement action, but certainly not with the current PCI list as we know them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Catharina, maybe it's good that you react to this point and then we move to the next.
Yeah. I mean, to a large extent, I agree with Dennis on what he said about the risks and the possible penalties. But I also think that on the risk-related incentives, there is perhaps some work that the regulators could do to also think of what these could be, because we still do hear very often the comments that the PCIs are more risky, are more difficult to be implemented than a purely national project. So we still do hear these kind of issues, and I think it's an area where we should continue looking into discussing with the promoters. I mean, asking then, why are you not asking the regulators to provide you with incentives, and then discuss also with the regulators to see what the regulatory frameworks allow today, what they don't allow. Are the regulatory frameworks on the two sides of the border compatible with each other? Because we also hear sometimes promoters raise the issue that yes, on the one side of the border it works, but on the other side of the border it doesn't work. So I think there is a lot of issues that one still needs to look more into before going any further in this area. Then I would like to comment on the cost allocation, if you allow, because I'm rather surprised by the results, which actually put 0% on the current practice, and then puts the majority of the votes to cross-border cost allocation with ex-post adjustment, or then an EU transmission tariff. I mean, of course, as a convinced European, I think an EU transmission tariff would be an interesting option. Not sure it would fly politically, but that's a different story, of course. But I'm a bit surprised on the cross-border cost allocation with ex-post adjustment, because in my view, it would create quite a lot of uncertainty, because then the ones who are investing would not know, when going to discuss with the banks, etc., for the financing, on who would be paying the project later on. So I think that could create some risks in terms of the financing of the project. And I actually would be very interested in hearing why so many of the participants propose that as the best option here.
Yeah, maybe there is some, yeah, it can be different interpretations, because if the ex-post adjustment could not create uncertainty if it says, if this happened, we reallocate the costs this way. So like the commitment, the deal is bulletproof in a way, but it will, the adjustment is already foreseen. It's not an open negotiation, let's say, that would create uncertainty.
Yeah, but you would still not know what your consumers would end up paying. You know that perhaps if things go like this, they pay this, but if they go the other way, they have to pay much more, for instance, and then you would have to increase the tariffs. So I think it would create at least discussion.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Dennis, would you like to react to this point also?
Yeah, on the cost allocation, I think here the novelty of the 10-year regulation was to think about projects which are, let's say, mainly which bring cost in one member state, but the benefits are mainly located in other member states. Which means if you would look at them at the member state level only, you would not go ahead, even though from a European perspective, they bring benefits to the population at large. And I think that there, conceptually, there's a very good idea in the 10-year regulation to say, well, actually, if we use a so-called cross-border cost allocation, we can, let's say, use those benefits to allocate part of the cost from the one member state which has to pay most to have them paid for by those citizens who are benefiting from the investment which is made in a neighboring member state. And I think that conceptually is a very good and powerful idea. What we do see in practice is that it's not always used in this way. In fact, the majority of cases is used quite in a different way. So we see that most of the projects which go through this cross-border cost allocation, the project itself, the investment is located only in one member state. And then when it comes to applying who should pay which part of the cost, in many cases it's a territorial principle, meaning that the place where the project is located is also where, let's say, the users will pay for the project. That means you're back to, let's say, the traditional way of financing. Everybody pays his own part of the pipe or whatever you're investing in, and you're not using the possibility of the 10-year regulation to allocate part of the cost cross-border. It has been done a few times. I think one of the well-known cases is the Jipol case, the gas interconnector Poland-Lithuania, where this, I think, is a classical example of how you can use a CBCA construction where Poland would pay the vast majority of the cost, but the benefits are mainly for Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And so what you do, you take those costs and you allocate part of them to the neighbors, and you make sure the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians have to pay part of the cost, and then overall it should work out. Now, the ex-post adjustment possibility, what also Catharina mentioned, indeed, as you said, Leonardo, it depends a bit on how you would implement that, because also the Jipol decision, which we took here at Acer, there is an ex-post adjustment possibility in there, but it's pretty strictly defined. It depends on the level of bookings for the Jipol pipe, which has to be assumed at a certain level to do the calculation in the beginning, but of course nobody knows what the level of bookings will be in the end. And then if there's more, let's say, more bookings made in practice than were foreseen in the decision, there's an automatic reduction of the payment needed from the neighbors, because in fact there's more commercial money flowing into the project. I think that's the kind of thing that you can do, let's say, reasonably well. It is specified in the decision. Everybody can see that all the costs will be covered, but they may be covered by different means depending on in this case, the bookings in the pipe. So I think overall, it's let's say in theory, conceptually, it's a very good instrument, but we do see that it's not used very often in the way it's meant to be, and that many project promoters go through the CBCA decision because they want to apply for CEF funding, and this is a necessary step to get there. And then CBCA can be seen a bit as a burden because it adds, of course, to the process and the bureaucracy that project promoters have to go through. It doesn't add value in really getting the benefits translated into a payment from the neighbors. It's just one step before you get to the CEF grant process.
Okay, thank you, Dennis. Catharina, maybe you can pick up the third point on financing. So there we see everybody wants to have a combination, basically, of different instruments. Maybe it's an opportunity for you to give us an update on to what extent these instruments have already been designed and are they started to be used. And
yeah, I mean, all the instruments now with the creation of the European Fund for Strategic Investment, or the so-called Juncker Plan, all the instruments are in place. So grants under CEF, and then all kinds of risk sharing and risk capital type of instruments through EIB, through this FC instrument. So they are all there. It is then for the promoters to get to us or to get to the EIB, and often we are bringing the promoters to meet the EIB. But what we have seen is that well, of course, many of our promoters have good relations with their commercial banks, so they continue discussing with their commercial banks. But very few of our TSOs or promoters have been proactively contacting the EIB in order to have debt or equity type of an instrument under the FC. So they contact the EIB for normal loans, but these type of risk-sharing instruments have not really been taken up sufficiently. We are exploring, we are looking into why this is. I mean, is our sector different from energy efficiency or renewables, which have had quite a lot of success in this area? Or are our projects sufficiently financed already through the market, through the commercial banks, etc., etc.? So that is something that has to some extent surprised us, because again, the CEF was meant to provide a lot of support for so-called financial instruments, and in the end, the CEF support goes mostly through grants to projects. So that's again a big question mark, but in the end, I do believe that we do need all instruments available, and we will continue to need grants also in the future, in addition to the financial markets in the area of energy.
okay, thank you. So then we go back to the slides, to the last part of the debate, and that is on the winter package. So I already said that for the moment the update on the infrastructure policy has not been included in that package. Catharina mentioned evaluation is ongoing. As you know, that the package was announced in the summer of 2015 as a new deal for consumers. So that's why I wanted to also have some reflection on that. So we created this EU infrastructure policy mainly for large infrastructure, centralized kind of view. Now we are talking more and more about decentralization, level playing field between demand and supply solutions. So have there already been some thinking about that in the context of the EU energy infrastructure policy? Do you see possibilities to maybe have also a new deal there for consumers? Catharina, maybe you would like to go first.
You're asking me already to comment on the results of the evaluation, which is quite ambitious.
Preview.
Okay, maybe just to perhaps explain why the focus has been on not necessarily big infrastructures, but cross-border infrastructures, let's put it that way. They can be small as well. Is because of the EU treaty and the legal base we are working within. And the Trans-European networks, they have a treaty article of their own, covering energy, transport and telecom sectors, and also the financing tools. So the CEF is for the Trans-European networks. And the aim of Trans-European networks is to connect member states' networks, basically. So that is why the focus has been on projects which have a cross-border impact directly or indirectly. But you are absolutely right that the big changes that we are seeing will take place more locally, will take place more decentralized, will look into new technologies, be it in storage or digitalization or general smartening of the grid. And I think it's a good question now to ask how to combine the Trans-European network focus with what needs to happen on a more local level. Whether this means that there has to be one instrument, one regulation, or whether this can be or should be addressed through different instruments, keeping Trans-European networks as Trans-European networks, bringing into the area other tools and other instruments. I think that's the question that we are currently looking into, and we expect some results of the evaluation by summer, and we hope to be able to speak with anybody who is interested to provide us with some input to this thinking, and then Commission will take its decision then later on whether we go for a policy reform or not. So that's still a completely open question.
Okay, thank you. Dennis, would you like to react to this, or you prefer to go to the Q&A?
No, maybe just to pick up on one thing that Catharina mentioned, which is important, I think, for people to realize. We're talking about, let's say, European infrastructure projects, but most of them are not really, let's say, European-wide. They are cross-border ones, or they have cross-border effects, but they're quite limited. The effect will be felt maybe in 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 member states. That's about it. Because I see in the discussion forum, there's a whole discussion about an EU transmission tariff, which sounds nice. But it basically means that you would, if you were to implement such a thing, you would have all European consumers pay for something which is basically a regional investment. And that's why I would say, in principle, I would still be in favor of something like a cross-border cost allocation decision, which really makes the users in the region who would profit from the investment pay for it as well, and not go to the European level where many parts of Europe will not be affected by this particular investment.
Okay. Thank you, Dennis. So we still have some minutes for Q&A. I also, on the background, you see a picture, by the way, of a training program we have at Florence School of Regulation on the Trans-European Energy Networks Regulation. And you can see also that Catharina and Dennis are instructors together with Nico and myself. So that's also a place where you could continue discussing with us. But we still have some time here, and I see many interesting questions on the chat box. Maybe I'll pick up the one of Julius, why not, the last one. So it's an element of the winter package I've heard before that is creating some unrest. There has been always this idea that the benefits from projects are partly market benefits, so they generate congestion rents, and the winter package foresees that they would need to be used for investment, kind of, instead of lowering transmission tariffs. And I guess that is a bit worrying to Julius. He's not fully convinced of that. So would one of you like to react to that? It's not directly infrastructure, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's related to the financing of infrastructure. But I think it's, but Dennis will correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, it's already foreseen in the third package that congestion rents should be used to remove the bottlenecks, and if that's not feasible for various reasons, then the revenues may be used to lowering the tariffs. And the provisions that we have introduced in this winter package actually strengthen these provisions to make it clear that when relevant, when the CBA test is positive, these revenues should be then used to remove the bottleneck that is there, so to use them to finance the infrastructure. Because we have also seen cases where there are considerable congestion rents on a bottleneck, and then a proposal to invest to remove the physical bottleneck, and then asking for EU grants. And there seemed to be a sort of a contradiction in that area, that there are important congestion rents, and yet there is a need for an EU grant. So I think our provisions aim at clarifying these, and there are a lot of work then for Acer on proposing on how to implement this provision in practice, well, following the adoption of the proposal, of course.
Okay, Dennis?
Yeah, I think on the congestion rents, as Catharina said, I think the principle is sound. You use the congestion rents to alleviate structural congestion. At the same time, you shouldn't go all the way to investing to the level where there's no congestion at all. Because if you go to that level, you've probably overinvested and it's too expensive. So there comes a point where you say, well, now the congestion is not so serious anymore, and probably the better use to make of these rents is to lower, in this case, the transportation tariffs. And then, let's say, if you do the CBA properly, that should help you to identify where it still makes sense, or when it still makes sense to invest in additional infrastructure at this particular location, and when you should stop investing, even though there is still some congestion, and give it back to the consumers in the form of lower tariffs.
Yeah. We have another question from Alejandro on storage. Besides decentralization, we are also more and more talking about energy storage technologies. So how is that already included in the 10E regulation? Could a big battery become a project of common interest?
Yes, storage, electricity storage was one of the new elements that was introduced in the regulation. It doesn't specify the technology, so any electricity storage is possible and can become a product of common interest, provided it meets the criteria, meaning it has a cross-border impact on at least 2 member states, and it contributes then to the EU energy policy objectives of completing internal market, secured supply, and renewable integration. Electricity projects are even eligible for co-financing under CEF, except hydro-pumped storage. And that is also a novelty, and there was recently in the latest call a compressed air storage project that actually received a grant for works on the basis of its technological innovation.
Okay. Okay.
Just to add that storage was already foreseen in the current regulation, so we don't have to add that one. But it's more traditional use of storage.
Okay. So I see many thank yous on the chat box for all your input. Maybe we can take one more question because we still have 2 minutes. I'm also reading at some of the questions I might have missed higher up. There were several also during our previous discussion. So I see multiple people typing. Everybody's already thanking us. Maybe I can ask one more question. When we talked about enforcement and penalties, I don't think you already mentioned that there is this provision that says if a promoter doesn't do the project and we really need it, that it could be tendered for. So in principle, that even gives opportunity to third parties. So has there been any more developments on that? Because that's a provision that I don't know how that will exactly be implemented if we would reach that. So maybe Dennis, you can start, and then we can ask Catharina.
Yeah, no, we're aware of the provision. It hasn't been used very often in practice. I mean, so far, normally if a project promoter proposes something, they will also try to make sure it moves forward. For me, it's a last resort provision. If somebody is really, let's say, blocking a certain infrastructure development which is really needed by making a proposal but not advancing it, you could take it away and tender it and say somebody else will now have the opportunity to build this particular piece of infrastructure. But I think it will be used very seldom in practice. It's good to have it as a backstop, but it will not be used very often, I think.
Okay.
Yeah,
Catharina?
I agree. It was always meant to be a last resort measure, and at least the possibility for the Commission to tender a project has never been used, and would be extremely interesting case study if it were to be used ever. But there are several steps before we would come to that, and the regulators, etc., would have to do their part first. I think it's useful, and sometimes when when you see the delays that we are facing with many projects, some of which have been on the, on the go-ahead point for a decade even, you start wondering, how long should we really wait before taking a bit stronger measures here. But let's leave that for a case study for one of your future trainings on how this tendering could be carried out in practice. So that would be challenging.
Okay. I think I join everybody on the forum in thanking you. That's been a very interesting, lively discussion. I thank also all the participants for answering to the polls and for being very active in the chat box. And at least what concerns me, I would be happy to do this again. It's a very nice way to connect with a lot of people to discuss a very specialized topic. And we covered a lot of ground in 1 hour. So thank you all.
Thanks to you for organizing, and thanks for all the participants. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.